dua was what? Forgiveness. And the last dua for all humanity is what? Forgive us. The guidance of Allah begins and ends with seeking forgiveness. And seeking, this astaghfirullah is not something small. It's not a small reason that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam asked istighfar of Allah 100 times. We'll solve that problem in a second. Why is Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam asking for Allah's forgiveness? We know that prophets are free of sin. And on top of that, Allah describes him, as I told you before, as a brilliant sun, flawless. So why is he asking for forgiveness if he hasn't even made any sins? You see, Allah Azza wa Jal will give us the reasons for which istighfar isn't just about doing a sin. Istighfar is about not doing enough. Istighfar is also about not doing enough. No human being should ever feel about themselves that they have done enough for Allah. They have always fallen short. For what Allah gave them, they can never give back. And so they ask Allah's forgiveness for their own shortcomings. You know, Ibrahim alayhi salam built the Kaaba. And when he built the Kaaba, after all those tests, I told you about that before. After all those tests, and when he was building the Kaaba, he said, وَتُبْ عَلَيْنَا, please accept our tawbah. Please forgive us. Why is he asking for forgiveness? Because as I'm putting one brick of the Kaaba on top of the other, I pray that this is good enough. I pray my salah is good enough. I pray my dua is good enough, because my dua may not be perfect, my salah may not be perfect, my qira'ah of Quran may not be perfect. Even when we do good deeds, those good deeds, are they perfect? No. And so because they're not perfect, what will complete, there's a gap. And that gap can only be filled by what words? Astaghfirullah. Astaghfirullah. Our ibadah will always be incomplete without istighfar to Allah Azza wa Jalla. We finish the salah, what's the masnoon dhikr to do? We finish the salah, the first thing we do is what? Astaghfirullah. You would think, normally, if you do something bad, you say astaghfirullah. I shouldn't have. You just did something good. You prayed. And we're taught right after you pray, you say what? Astaghfirullah. Why? Because that prayer was not perfect. And Allah will cover. Istighfar comes from mighfar. Mighfar actually means to cover. I ask Allah to cover the shortcomings of my prayer. I ask Allah to cover what wasn't good enough. I ask Allah to cover all the times in my head when I was still on Facebook, when I was reciting Fatiha. When I was in ruku' staring at the carpet and it looked like a face is looking back at me. I'm making istighfar for all the things that I didn't do well. When I rushed through the wudu, and I didn't really pay attention. When I was in the middle of a conversation and somebody asked me, hey, where did you put the keys? Allahu Akbar, and they're on the dresser. And in my head, I'm still answering their question, but I'm reciting Subhanakallahumma bihamdika, astaghfirullah. Astaghfirullah. My good deed wasn't good enough, so astaghfirullah. So this is the story of istighfar. We have to admit that we don't do well enough, and that even our good deeds need covering. We cannot become confident. Some people, the Prophet ﷺ said that for one letter of reciting Quran, you get 10 good deeds. You get 10 good deeds. And sometimes there are different adhkar that are mentioned, or different deeds that are mentioned, like salah and jama'ah counts 27 times more, right? So there are multiplications. I've met some people that like to do these calculations. Today, 50,000 times this, and I think I caught Laylatul Qadr, so that's like 83, years, Alf Shahr, so that's 83 years, and I've got this I'm doing pretty good. Doesn't matter how many calculations you do, it's still going to be not good enough. And the only thing that will cover it is istighfar. That's the one part. What's one part of istighfar? What's the other part of istighfar? That's the scarier part. When some people become impressed, I remind myself of this, I remind you of all of you of this. When some people become impressed with their own good deeds, then they are following the footsteps of shaitan. And it doesn't matter if those are prayers, and it doesn't matter if that's hajj, and it doesn't matter if it's anything else. If you yourself are impressed with the good that you have done, you're impressed with how patient you are, you're impressed with how kind you are, you're impressed with how much you pray, you are impressed with how much you recite. When you become impressed with yourself, the door of istighfar is closed. Even if you say astaghfirullah, you don't mean it. Because you think it's perfect, you're perfect already. So those are just words, they don't mean anything. The istighfar means nothing if it's not coming from the heart. If you don't acknowledge, and I don't acknowledge that we are flawed, that what we do is not good enough, You know, one time Ali radiallahu anhu was passing by someone who was saying, Astaghfirullah, 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 astaghfirullah. And he said, your istighfar needs istighfar. You know. So the last thing I share with you about istighfar, not only does it cover our flaws, not only does it teach us humility, and it teaches us, profoundly, it teaches us that we aren't perfect and we will always be making mistakes and we have to admit our mistakes to Allah. By the way, on that note, it's not easy to admit your mistake to another person. Somebody says to you, hey, I didn't like what you said. What? What did I say? Huh? It was perfectly right what I said. What are you talking about? You didn't understand what I said. There's a problem with you, not with me. When somebody points out your mistake, you get defensive. I didn't make a mistake. Guess who got defensive when his mistake was pointed out? Iblis. And when you become defensive, there's no way you'll ask Allah's forgiveness. Yes, it's hard to admit our mistakes in front of people. But if you get in the habit of defending yourself every time, it will be hard for you and hard for me to admit ourselves before Allah. It'll be hard for us to say, Ya Allah, I messed up, I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't do this. I shouldn't do this. And I'm seeking genuinely your forgiveness. So being able to admit your mistake is actually a step towards istighfar. Shaitan doesn't even want us to admit it. So finally the benefits. What do you get when you make istighfar? Not only do your sins get covered, not only is it the last steps before we walk into Jannah. وَاغْفِرْ لَنَا وَاغْفِرْ لَنَا. The last words before people enter into Jannah. But in addition, Nuh alayhi salam told us something.